The Galactic Military Academy had been running the Vorathian Crucible for 63 years. 63 years. That is not a metaphor. That is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. The simulation had been active, continuously running, updated, recalibrated, and refined across 6 decades of interstellar military scholarship, and in all that time, not a single cadet cohort had ever won. Not once. The best performance on record belonged to a Drelhari Firecast team, who lasted 9 simulated days before their command structure collapsed under logistical fatigue. They still have a plaque. They threw a ceremony. There were speeches. The Drelhari are very proud of that plaque. The simulation was designed by Admiral Vas Kalindra, a Theran strategic genius whose 6-lobed brain had personally modeled every variable in the scenario, and whose published thesis on the psychological limits of command under attrition had become required reading at 42 academies across the Confederacy. The Vorathian Crucible was not meant to be won. It was meant to teach cadets the architecture of defeat, to show them how wars grind down even the most brilliant minds, to demonstrate through immersive suffering that prolonged conflict has no clean resolutions, only managed catastrophes. Beautiful, horrible, pedagogically perfect. Kalindra had called it, and I quote, "the most elegant instrument of educational despair ever constructed." She said that at a gala. People applauded. So when the Academy Registrar, a meticulous Salindri named Faraxis Ben, submitted the intake forms for Cohort 7 Gamma, nobody thought anything unusual was happening. The paperwork looked normal. The biometric scans processed without incident. It was only when Faraxis cross-referenced the planetary origin codes that she paused, stared at her screen for approximately 4 seconds longer than she stared at anything else, and then quietly walked to the office of Commandant Dravos Thal to deliver the news in person. "Sir," she said, "Cohort 7 Gamma is composed entirely of humans." Commandant Thal, who was in the middle of eating his 3rd meal of the cycle, set down his fork. He looked at Ferocis. Ferocis looked at him. They shared the particular silence of 2 beings who both understood that something had gone wrong somewhere, but neither could identify exactly where. "All of them?" he said. "All 12, she confirmed. He picked his fork back up. "Well," he said, "they'll learn something." He was not wrong. They did learn something. It just was not what he expected. The 12 humans arrived on the station transport looking, by most accounts, profoundly unconcerned. This was the first warning sign that nobody recognized as a warning sign. Cadet Nyoka Asante was the first one off the shuttle, and she walked down the ramp the way someone walks into a building they already own. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and she had a notebook, a physical notebook, paper, with a pen. The orientation officer, a young Velthari named Priso, stared at it like she had produced a ceremonial weapon. Behind her came Cadet Tadashi Furuya, who was apparently already mid-conversation with Cadet Reva Okonkwo about load-bearing capacity in low-gravity siege scenarios, and neither of them paused when they stepped off the shuttle. They just kept talking, gesturing with their hands, occasionally interrupting each other to say, "No, wait, but if you account for," and then immediately getting interrupted back. Behind them, Cadet Imani Zarasa was reading something on her datapad, walking without looking where she was going, and somehow not colliding with anything. Behind her, Cadet Soren Brask was eating, because of course he was. And behind him came the remaining 7, in various states of alertness ranging from mildly curious to already taking notes on the station architecture. Priso had processed 412 cadets over the past 3 rotations. She had never once felt nervous doing it. She felt nervous now. She introduced herself. She explained the schedule. She outlined the rules of the academy, the code of conduct, the chain of command, the consequences for insubordination. The humans listened. They asked questions. Good questions. Precise, uncomfortable, very specific questions about things like maintenance cycle timing on the simulation pods, and whether the scenario parameters were updated in real time or on a fixed schedule. Priso answered as best she could. She then filed a note in the administrative system flagging the cohort for instructor attention, which is the Academy's polite way of saying someone else needs to deal with this. The note was reviewed by Senior Instructor Galiv Soon, a veteran Tharan strategist who had run the Crucible orientation briefing for 11 years. He read the note, pulled the cohort's entrance examination scores, and sat with them for a while. The humans had scored, without exception, in the top percentile of every tactical reasoning assessment. Not the top percentile for their species. The top percentile for all species, combined, this cycle. Cadet Asante had answered a multivariable resource allocation problem in a way that the automated grading system had initially flagged as an error because it had not encountered that particular solution pathway before. The grading system had to be updated. Galiv Sohn did not update the administrative note. Instead, he walked to Commandant Thal's office and stood in the doorway until the Commandant looked up. "The humans," Galiv said. "Yes," said Thal. "I think we should observe their first session." Thal leaned back in his chair. "It's an orientation run, low parameters. We do not observe orientation runs." "I know," said Galiv. "I think we should anyway." Thal looked at him for a moment. Galiv had been his strategic advisor for 9 years. He was not an anxious being. He was not given to unnecessary caution. He was standing in the doorway with the very particular expression of someone who has read something they cannot unread. "Fine," said Thal. "We observe." The Vorathian Crucible, for those unfamiliar with it, simulates a decade-long interplanetary war across a mid-sized star system with 12 contested planets, 14 mobile resource platforms, a civilian population of approximately 9 billion simulated lives, 3 factional powers with competing interests, and a military budget that degrades at a fixed rate designed to eventually make every strategic choice a choice between 2 bad options. The AI managing the opposing forces, designated Vora, had been trained on the actual battle records of 46 historical wars and was explicitly programmed to adapt to cadet tactics in real time, meaning the longer cadets engaged with it, the better it became at defeating them. Most cohorts spent their first session just trying to understand the scope of the scenario. The briefing alone ran 40 minutes. Cadets were typically overwhelmed by the information load before the simulation even began. Galiv Soon and Commandant Thal settled into the observation deck above the simulation bay. Below them, through the transparent partition, 12 humans sat around a hexagonal briefing table, listening to the scenario introduction. Priso was running it. She was very good at this part. She had a practiced, calming delivery designed to ease cadets into the enormity of what they were facing. She finished the introduction. She asked if there were questions. All 12 humans started talking at once, not in confusion, not in protest. They were talking to each other, rapidly, pointing at the scenario map, which was projected above the table in 3 dimensions, and pointing at specific planets, specific resource lines, specific timelines on the conflict progression chart. Nyoka Asante had her notebook out. Tadashi and Reva had resumed the conversation they had apparently never actually stopped, only paused, and they were now using the simulation map as a visual aid for whatever argument they had been having since the shuttle. Imani Dizarasa had her datapad out and was cross-referencing something, her eyes moving between the map and her screen very quickly. Soren Brask had finished eating and was now writing on a napkin. A napkin! Priso stood at the head of the table, looking out at this, and then she looked up at the observation window. She could not see Galiv and Thal through the one-way partition, but she looked up anyway, as if she could feel them watching. Then she looked back at her cadets. "Should I begin the simulation?" she asked. "Give us 4 minutes," said Nyoka Asante, without looking up from her notebook. Priso blinked. "The standard preparation period is 45 minutes. 4, Asante repeated. The 4 minutes were, by all accounts, the most intensely focused 4 minutes the simulation bay had ever contained. The humans argued, agreed, disagreed, agreed again, split tasks, assigned roles, and by the end of it, Soren Brask's napkin was covered in what turned out to be a tiered resource prioritization chart that a logistics analyst would later describe as alarmingly coherent. "Ready," said Asante. "That was 3 minutes and 51 seconds, noted Riva Okonkwo. "I know," said Asante. I gave us a buffer. Up in the observation bay, Galiv soon turned to Commandant Thal. They've been alive for less than one standard Confederacy lifespan, he said quietly. I know, said Thal. Their species has only had faster-than-light travel for 60 years. I know. 60 years ago, they were still. I know, said Thal. And there was something in his voice that was not quite concern, and not quite awe, and was very much both at the same time. The simulation began. The first thing Vora did, which it always did, was apply early pressure to the outer resource platforms to test cadet response times and decision-making under immediate stress. Most cohorts scrambled. Most cohorts made at least one catastrophic logistical error in the first simulated week while they were still finding their footing. Cohort 7 Gamma did not scramble. Nyoka Asante gave 3 orders in the first simulated hour. Just 3. They were short orders. The kind of short that only happens when someone has already thought far enough ahead that they don't need to explain themselves. Cadet Ren Solberg, who had been assigned fleet coordination, executed the first 2 before Asante had finished giving the third, because apparently Ren had anticipated where the orders were going. Cadet Olu Bancroft, handling civilian logistics, had already rerouted 2 population centers before Vora's pressure reached them, as if he had not been reacting to Vora's move, but to Vora's intention. In the observation bay, Galiv soon pulled up Vora's internal conflict modeling. He wanted to see how the AI was reading the situation. Vora was already recalibrating. This was unusual. Recalibration typically didn't begin until the 3rd or 4th simulated day. Vora had flagged something in Cohort 7 Gamma's opening moves as a pattern it had not previously encountered, and was adjusting its tactical model. It's already adapting, Galiv murmured. Below, Tadashi Furuya looked up from his station and said to no one in particular, "It's adapting." Reva Okonkwo, without looking up from her own screen, said, "Good." "Good?" said Cadet Preti Malhotra from the far end of the table. "We want it to adapt," said Reva. "We want to show it something it hasn't seen before, so it has to rebuild its model. Every time it rebuilds, it wastes cycles. We want it rebuilding constantly." Galiv Sohn stared at the back of Reva Okonkwo's head. Then he looked at Thal. Thal was looking at the simulation readout, and his expression had shifted into something Galiv had not seen on his commanding officer's face in 11 years of working together. It took Galiv a moment to identify it, because it was not a common expression on a Theron. It was not concern. It was not pride. It was not awe. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you realize, very quietly, that something you built is not the most dangerous thing in the room anymore. By the 3rd simulated month, Vora had rebuilt its tactical model 4 times. This had never happened before. The previous record was 1 rebuild, achieved by the Drellharry Firecast team, and it had taken them 6 simulated days to force it. Cohort 7 Gamma had forced 4 rebuilds in 90 simulated days, and the way they were doing it was making Galiv soon increasingly reluctant to blink, because every time he looked away for more than 30 seconds, something had changed on the board. The humans did not fight like a military unit. They fought like a single organism with 12 processing centers, each one handling a different layer of the problem simultaneously, and all 12 feeding information back to Nyoka Asante, who sat at the head of the table with her notebook and her pen and the very calm, very focused expression of someone who had prepared for exactly this, and had also prepared for everything adjacent to this, and had probably prepared for several things nobody had thought of yet. She did not micromanage. That was the thing that kept catching Galiv off guard. Most cadet commanders, even the good ones, got tighter as pressure increased, issuing more orders, demanding more updates, trying to hold every thread themselves. Asante did the opposite. As the simulation escalated, she gave fewer orders, not more, and the orders she gave were so precisely timed that they hit the exact moment when her team needed direction and not a second before. She was not reacting to the war, she was conducting it. VORA escalated. That was its function. That was what it was built to do. When cadets adapted, VORA adapted faster, applying pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously, creating situations where every good option had a cost attached, grinding down resources and morale in the patient, grinding way that real wars ground things down. It had broken every cohort this way, not through a single devastating blow, but through accumulation, debt, fatigue, the slow erosion of margin until there was no margin left and every decision was a bad one. Galeev watched Vora apply this strategy to Cohort 7 Gamma, and watched, with a fascination that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, as the humans absorbed it. Not neutralized it, absorbed it. Cadet Imani Dzirasa was running the economic modeling, and she had built something in the first hour that Galeev only now fully understood, a cascading resource buffer that intentionally ran lean on secondary systems to maintain surplus in the 3 areas that mattered most, rotating which systems were lean based on projected threat timelines. It looked, from the outside, like the cohort was perpetually almost out of something. And they were. They were always almost out of something, but they were never out of the thing that mattered right now. And by the time the thing that mattered right now changed, the buffer had already rotated. Vora kept targeting the lean systems. Vora kept finding that the lean systems had just been restocked, and the thing it had ignored had just become lean. Vora was, in a computational sense, chasing a moving target that Imani Dzirasa had designed to look catchable while never quite being caught. Galeev pulled up Vora's confidence ratings. They were declining. He had never seen Vora's confidence ratings decline. They were not supposed to decline. He turned to say something to Commandant Thal and found that Thal had leaned so far forward in his observation chair that he was essentially hovering over the partition, both hands flat on the surface in front of him, watching the simulation board with the full, undivided attention of a being who had completely forgotten he was eating anything when this started. The 6th simulated month was when things got complicated. VOAA, having burned through 4 tactical models and apparently decided that conventional escalation was not producing results, did something it had never done in 63 years of operation. It introduced a civilian crisis simultaneous with a military offensive, creating a situation where the cohort's resources had to split between humanitarian response and active defense, with the explicit design of making both responses insufficient if the cohort tried to do both. This was, strategically speaking, a masterpiece of computational cruelty. The academicians who had reviewed the Crucible's parameters after the fact would later describe this move as Vora operating outside its documented behavioral range, which is a polite way of saying the AI improvised, which is a thing it was technically capable of but had never actually done before because it had never needed to. In the simulation bay, the 12 humans went quiet for approximately 6 seconds. 6 seconds is nothing. 6 seconds is barely a pause. But Galeev had been watching these people for 6 simulated months of compressed time, and he had never seen them go quiet, not once, not even for a moment. And those 6 seconds felt enormous. Then Soren Brask said, "She's testing us." "Vora's not a she," said Priti Malhotra. "Vora just improvised," said Soren. "That means we rattled her. That means we're winning." "We're not winning yet," said Asante, who had not looked up from her notebook. "But we could," said Tadashi. Asante looked up. She looked at the board. She looked at the civilian crisis unfolding on the left side of the display and the military offensive building on the right, and she did the thing that Galeev had watched her do many times now, which was to go very still for a moment, in the way that some beings go still when they are thinking very fast. Then she said, "We're not splitting, Ren. Collapse the outer defensive line to the 3rd ring. Olu, reroute all civilian transports through the Cathara corridor. Imani, I need a cost projection for temporary abandonment of platforms 7 and 9. Ren was already moving. Olu said, "Cathara's exposed. It will be for 11 minutes, said Asante. Vora can't exploit it in 11 minutes because she's already committed the offensive force to the right flank. By the time she rebalances, the transports are through." Olu looked at the board. Looked at Asante. Executed the order. Galeev watched Vora register the collapse of the outer defensive line and begin calculating exploitation options. watched it model the Cathara corridor and flag it as an opportunity, watched it begin to rebalance its offensive force, and watched it arrive at the realization, 9 simulated minutes and 40 seconds later, that the civilian transports had already cleared the corridor and the window had closed. VOA's confidence rating dropped another 4 points. It was Feroxy Ben, the Academy Registrar, who first noticed the time. She had come to the observation bay to deliver a scheduling update to Commandant Thal, which she never actually delivered because she stopped in the doorway, looked at the simulation display, looked at the elapsed time counter, and said, "That cannot be right." Thal turned. "What?" "The elapsed time," she said, pointing. "Real time." Galeev looked. The simulation had a dual timer, one tracking internal simulated time, one tracking real time in the observation bay. The simulated time read 6 years, 4 months, 11 days. The real time read 51 minutes and 17 seconds. Galeev stared at it. "That's," he said, and then stopped because he was doing the math, and the math was producing a number that didn't make immediate sense, and he wanted to check it, so he checked it. Cohort 7 Gamma was processing simulated time at a compression ratio that was, conservatively, 4 times faster than any previous cohort. Not because the simulation was running faster, the simulation was running at standard parameters. The humans were just operating at a tempo that was compressing the effective decision cycle of the war itself. They were moving fast enough to make time irrelevant. "Get Admiral Kalindra on a channel," Thal said, and his voice was very quiet. Feroxy said, "Sir, it's the middle of her sleep cycle. Wake her up." By the 58th minute, the simulation was in year 9. VORA had rebuilt its model 3 more times in the last 23 real minutes. And what Galeev was watching now was something he did not have a precise word for, something that sat at the intersection of strategy and instinct, and a kind of terrible creative intelligence that the Academy had never designed its training to produce, because it had never imagined it needed to. The humans were not just winning, they were systematically dismantling a decade-long war, as if they had already read the ending and were simply executing the steps to get there in the most efficient order possible. Reva Okonkwo had taken Vora's 3 remaining major military assets and, over the course of 8 simulated months, positioned them in a configuration that looked, from Vora's internal modeling, like a 3-front threat that required defensive response on all sides. Vora had spread to counter it, which was exactly what Reva needed, because Preeti Malhotra had spent those same 8 months rebuilding the abandoned platforms 7 and 9, quietly, incrementally, without ever doing anything that looked like a significant resource commitment, and those platforms were now fully operational and sitting behind Vora's spread defensive line like a question Vora had forgotten to ask. "She's going to close the pocket," said Tadashi Furuya. And there was something in his voice, not triumph exactly, more like the specific satisfaction of watching a very long equation finally balance. "Not yet," said Asante. "Let her commit the reserve." "She won't commit the reserve if she sees it coming." "She won't see it coming," said Asante. "Because Soren is going to do something very stupid in the next 4 minutes." Everyone at the table looked at Soren Brask. Soren looked at Asante. Then he looked at the board. Then he started smiling. Slowly, in the way someone smiles when they have just been handed an assignment that is specifically terrible, and they are absolutely the right person for it. "How stupid," he said. "Catastrophically," said Asante. What Soren did, 4 simulated minutes later, was launch a direct assault on Vora's primary command installation with a force so inadequate for the task that Vora's threat assessment protocol classified it as either a feint or an error, and then, upon determining it was neither, committed its reserve force to repel it because the optics of losing a command installation to an obviously doomed assault were too damaging to absorb. The reserve moved. VORA's defensive line had a gap. Nyoka Asante gave one order. It was 4 words. Galeev would think about those 4 words for a long time afterward. He would think about the fact that she had known, from the beginning of that sequence, exactly what 4 words she was going to say, and that every move in the preceding months had been arranged to create the moment where those 4 words were sufficient. He would think about that, and he would feel the particular vertiginous feeling you get when you realize you have been watching something operate at a level you can recognize but not replicate. She said, "Preeti, close it now." The simulation ended at 59 minutes and 44 seconds. Not with a dramatic final battle, not with a surrender ceremony or a climactic confrontation. The Vorathian Crucible ended because Vare's command infrastructure collapsed simultaneously across all 3 remaining fronts. Its reserve was out of position, its resource lines were cut, and its civilian support had been maintained by Olu Bancroft at a level that made continued resistance computationally untenable. The AI ran its projections, determined that no available action could alter the outcome, and flagged the scenario as resolved. In 63 years of operation, it had never flagged a scenario as resolved. The simulation bay was silent for a moment. Then Riva Okonkwo said yes in a very quiet, very sincere voice, and Tadashi Furuya put his head down on the table, and Preeti Malhotra made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly something that had no name. Soren Brask pulled out another napkin, looked at his original napkin, looked at the board, and then carefully folded the new napkin and put it away, apparently satisfied that it was not needed. Naoka Asante closed her notebook. Up in the observation bay, Galiv soon became aware that Admiral Vas Kalindra was standing beside him. She had arrived somewhere in the last 10 minutes. He had not noticed. She was still wearing her sleep cycle clothes, and she was looking at the elapsed time counter with an expression that was completely, utterly unreadable. Galiv had studied under Admiral Kalindra for 3 years. He had never seen her expression be unreadable. "My simulation," she said finally. "Yes, Admiral. In under an hour, 59 minutes and 44 seconds. She was quiet for a long time. Below them, the 12 humans were doing something that took Galiv a moment to process. They were not celebrating. Not really. They were debriefing. Immediately, voluntarily, already picking apart their own decisions, identifying the moments where they had been slower than they could have been, the resources they had left on the table, the 2 or 3 junctures where Vora could have found a gap if it had looked slightly differently. They were critiquing a victory the way most beings could not critique a defeat. "They're already looking for what they did wrong," said Commandant Thal. "They won," said Kalindra. "I know," said Thal. "That's why they're looking for what they did wrong." Kalindra turned to look at him. Then she turned back to the observation window. Below, Noka Asante had reopened her notebook and was writing something, and whatever she was writing, Imani Dzirasa was leaning over to read it, and whatever she read made her nod slowly and pull out her datapad. 63 years, Kalindra said, not sadly, not bitterly, with the very specific tone of someone revising a prior understanding. "I built that scenario to show cadets that some things cannot be won, that prolonged conflict corrodes even the finest minds." She paused. "I built it for species who found the scale of it overwhelming," Galiv said, carefully. "And for humanity?" Kalindra watched Nyoka Asante write in her notebook. She watched Soren Brask steal someone's lunch off the table beside him. She watched Tadashi and Reva start arguing again, immediately, about something on the debrief readout. Both of them energized rather than exhausted, sharp rather than ground down, as if the last 59 minutes had been, for them, not a grueling trial but something closer to an appetizer. "For humanity," she said slowly, "I think I need to build a new simulation." She left the observation bay without another word, already thinking. Galivson stayed at the window a while longer. He watched the 12 cadets work through their debrief, loud and fast, and relentlessly self-critical, and he thought about what Reva Okonkwo had said when Vora first began adapting, that flat, cheerful, deeply unreasonable word, good. He thought about a species that had been among the stars for 60 years, barely long enough to qualify as newcomers, arriving at the oldest military academy in the Confederacy with paper notebooks and napkin charts, and the specific, unbothered confidence of people who had not yet been told what they were supposed to find impossible. He thought about the plaque on the wall outside the simulation bay, the one commemorating the Drelhari Firecast team and their record 9 simulated days. The plaque that had stood for 31 years, they were going to need a bigger plaque.